I'm Louisa Rice. I'm interim associate vice chancellor in academic affairs, but also more importantly, a historian. And I'm here today because Erica Benson would typically be here. She's working remotely today, so she's tuning in on Zoom with some of the folks. So it is a delight to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Andrew Sturtevant, who is associate professor in the history department and an affiliate in the American Indian Studies program. He is going to present today on Pontiac's Other War, Imperial and Indigenous Politics, 1701 to 1766. Couple of housekeeping items. We'll have some time afterwards for questions. Remote viewers should be able to post their questions in the chat, and then we can hear them in the room. And then when you do get questions, if you can repeat them, because people at home may not be able to hear them terribly well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to Erica and Absentia and to ORSP for your very generous support of my research over the years, of Erica's travel money, and most importantly, sabbatical in the last academic year, so that I can work on this project, which is an adaptation of my doctoral dissertation into a manuscript about Pontiac's War. Okay. I'm going to start today by doing a land acknowledgement and acknowledging that the university and the town of Eau Claire sits on the ancestral lands of both the Dakota and Ojibwa people, and I acknowledge their presence here and their continuing presence here as well. I also acknowledge that Eau Claire is part of the ceded territory given to the United States, or bought by the United States in 1837 by a treaty signed under unequal power relationships in which the Ojibwa were more or less forced to give up their territory. So I want to acknowledge that as an invitation to think about what restorative justice and restoration looks like in the context of UWEC and Eau Claire. Okay. Before I start, I want to do a little bit of orientation because I realize that not all of you are versed in the history of Detroit. As I am devoted at least 15 years to this study. So I've given you a map here of Detroit. Just a really quick background. Detroit was founded as a fur trading post by the French in 1701. Continued to be a French fort up until 1760, when the British defeat them and take possession of Detroit. It is also the home of several different Native American groups, including the two I'll be focusing on today, the Wyandots, which you might know as the Huron, and the Odawa over here, known in plural in their own language as the Odawaag. I'll also be talking a little bit about the Odawa, known to us more familiarly as the Potawatomi, and the Ojibwaag, or Ojibwa Anishinaabe people that live in this part of the country as well. So on May 10th, 1763, the Odawa headman, Pontiac, enraged at British treatment of Native people and hopeful that the French might return to New France, launched an attack on the British garrison at Detroit. The ensuing conflict, now known as Pontiac's War, has become a touchstone in American history. In the first major pan-Indigenous movement, a coalition of separate peoples throughout the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley cooperated to contest British imperial rule. The very next day, on May 11th, Pontiac resumed a conflict of a very different sort. Visiting the Wyandotte village, see right here, which is almost adjacent to the Odawa village, Pontiac came to deliver an ultimatum. Earlier that spring, Pontiac had invited the Wyandots to join his coalition, an offer that they had unceremoniously rejected. Now Pontiac insisted that they join and threatened to, quote, cut them to pieces if they refused. Angry at the Odawa's threat of violence and presumption of authority over them, some of the Wyandotte warriors instead suggested that they attack the Odawa instead of the British. Ultimately, however opposed they were to Pontiac's war with the British, the Wyandots had little choice but to consent to Pontiac's demand. Pontiac's coalition, composed predominantly of Odawa, Potawatomi, and Ojibwa warriors, vastly outnumbered the Wyandots. As the Wyandotte leader Teata lamented, even if the Wyandots tried to flee Detroit, Pontiac's forces would quote, fall upon us and kill our wives and children, and then compel us to assist them anyway. The Wyandots therefore grudgingly conceded to Pontiac's demands, promising to join the siege of Detroit after they had celebrated Mass the following day, May 12th. As the Wyandots would later complain to anyone who was willing to listen, they had been, quote, compelled to take up arms against Detroit by the Odawas. This paper narrates the story of these two separate but ultimately intertwined struggles. One struggle pitted the Odawa leader Pontiac and a coalition of his supporters against Great Britain. The second struggle, Pontiac's other war, was a continuation of a much longer conflict between Pontiac's people, the Odawaag, and their near neighbors, the Wyandots. By 1763, the two neighbors had been fighting for status and authority for at least a century, and they continued this age-old conflict during Pontiac's war against the British enemies. These two conflicts, one against the British and the other between two indigenous groups, ran in tandem like separate but interlacing strands, occasionally intertwining and overlapping with one another. Ultimately, Pontiac's other war with the Wyandots bent the trajectory of the first war with the British. This paper and the larger project from which it comes, therefore seeks to position Pontiac's war in its most immediate context, a set of dynamics, relationships, and negotiations worked out by the indigenous peoples living at Detroit over the preceding 6 decades. As the story demonstrates, indigenous politics, the complicated network of alliances and rivalries between native peoples, overlapped with imperial politics, the attempts of European powers to assert control over Eastern North America. Now, one of the clearest iterations of British Native American conflict, Pontiac's War, was itself embedded in a dense lattice of indigenous relationships, demonstrates the importance of indigenous peoples and the alliances they built to American history. Since I see some students from both History 288 and 489, our two halves of the capstone sequence, I'm going to very briefly frame what I'm doing here in terms that we've talked about in class. So this is an extra class for you guys. So we talked about approaching historical arguments in this sort of way, right? So my job as a historian is to get you from this point where your ideal reader believes X about a topic to that point over there where your ideal reader believes something different or understands something different about that topic, and to slowly move you along in that process. Okay, so my goal today is to get you from this point, which I presume many of you are at, that we tend to think about issues like Pontiac's War as mostly about imperial politics, right? Mostly about how indigenous people are relating to and forming alliance with or resisting the Europeans. And my goal in the next 25 minutes is to get you over here, right? To see that those imperial politics were very important, but so were these indigenous politics, the relations between different indigenous peoples and the rivalries and networks and alliances that they built over the years, right? So hopefully I can get you moving in that direction. The first thing I want to do is just briefly talk about my methodology here. So to anticipate some questions you might have, obviously we are very limited in understanding indigenous peoples in the 18th century because most of the written documents that we have are from the perspectives of European who are reflexively and instinctively racialist or racist and certainly ethnocentric, right? So I employ the methodology of ethnohistory, which uses those documents, but it also is informed by indigenous oral tradition, linguistics, geography, material culture, and what we know of indigenous cultures to reinterpret those racist documents and to privilege indigenous perspectives and voices, right? So in the words of the ethnohistorian Dan Richter, I'm going to try to face east to understand native perspectives on these events rather than the traditional Western-facing perspective of the Europeans. And I can talk more about my methodology and what that entails if you have questions about that. Okay, so let's start by talking about this set of imperial relationships and talk about Pontiac's war with Great Britain. And as you'll see here, this war was a response to the imposition of British imperialism and the attempt by Pontiac and others to oust the British and return to the French era status quo. Right, so Pontiac's war, his anti-colonial campaign against the British, is a familiar touchstone in early American history. I'm guessing many of you have maybe heard about it, maybe ring a bell. Certainly the name Pontiac probably is familiar to you, and has become for historians a really important event. The conflict in some ways was the last fight in a centuries-old imperial contest for North America. Since the early 17th century, the French and British crowns had been fighting for territory in North America, and especially access to beaver pelts and other furs from the Great Lakes and Ohio valleys. Simon de Champlain and his successors had developed a burgeoning trade in Great Lakes peltry in the St. Lawrence Valley, and later the French would lay claim to the entire Mississippi Valley as well as the Great Lakes. The British countered by establishing posts in Hudson's Bay and Albany, New York, and later at the site of Oswego in Lake Ontario, in an attempt to siphon off furs from the French. The British and the French would fight a series of hot and cold wars over the following years as they vied for the best beaver pelts and for territory and for alliance with the peoples in this region. Eager for access to European goods, the peoples of the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley had generally supported the French in this contest. In the middle and late 17th century, the peoples of this region worked out a status quo with the French that worked more or less to the benefit of all parties. I certainly don't want to romanticize this relationship here, but compared to what happens later, there is much more of a mutuality between the French and their allies. Native American hunters provided beaver pelts for a hungry European market and willing military aid against the British when required. In return, the French guaranteed access to European firearms, textiles, and other goods, and military alliance against the natives' own rivals, such as the Haudenosaunee, also known historically as the Iroquois, and the Foxes or Meskwaki people. Acutely aware of their dependence upon the goodwill of their native allies, the French generally treated native people with respect, providing yearly outlays of goods to their allies, and ritually covering the deaths of their esteemed leaders, a tradition which they often complained about, but always complied with when native people asked them. Couching the alliance in familiar terms, the peoples of the area referred to the French governor general as a generous father, and the governor took care of his native children. Yet the metaphor meant something quite different for the peoples of the region than it did for the French. The French, coming from a patriarchal and monarchical society, understood the familiar relationship as one of subordination and seniority. The father spoke and the children listened. Most indigenous people in the area, however, interpreted the terms in a different context. Familial connections such as these required mutual obligations from both partners and both parent and child. And fathers set an example rather than strictly policing their children's behavior. When they called the French their fathers, they were not acknowledging the European superiority, but instead calling on them to perform the parental duties and to protect and supply them. French governors learned over and over and complained about this a lot, that their children remained autonomous and often refused to do what they wanted them to do. When the Odawa voiced their admiration for their French father, therefore, or as Pontiac did, claim to be French, they invoked an old alliance of equals traveling in tandem rather than hierarchy and subjecthood. This delicate status quo came to a screeching halt in 1759, when the British finally defeated the French in the 7 Years' War and ended a century-long imperial conflict. For more than a century, the French had respected and collaborated with many of the native peoples of the region, again regarding them as trading partners and military allies. When the British arrived, however, they quickly signaled that they had no intention of treating native people with such respect and regard, and systematically contravened the previous diplomatic status quo that the Odawa and others had come to expect from their imperial allies. Feeling the fiscal pinch from the late war, for example, the British refused to present their native allies with the same tokens of respect, yearly outlays of gunpowder, alcohol, and cloth. Even worse, the British often treated native peoples with open contempt. The second British commander of Detroit, for example, Henry Gladwin, called native people hags and other names, telling them to get along and go about their business, and would not hear them. Native people interpreted these signs of disrespect for exactly what they were: evidence of British disdain for native people. Whereas the French had regarded the natives as indispensable allies and respected friends, the British saw them as racial inferiors and expensive allies. By the fall of 1762, Pontiac and the Odawa and many other people in the region had had quite enough of the British. Angered at what they called the dogs clothed in red, he advocated for the return of French rule in the region. And in fact, he proclaimed that he was French and would die French. Buoyed by rumors that the French were sending an armada to reconquer New France and restore the former status quo, and by the revivalist message of the Lenape mystic Neolin, Pontiac traveled throughout the region and conferred with people as distant as the Shawnees on the Scioto River and the Illinois. By 1763, these people had forged an alliance of native peoples eager to join together to defeat the British and prepare the way for a French return to the region. They were strikingly successful. In short order, members of the coalition had captured 9 of the 14 British posts in the Trans-Appalachian West and had captured many of His Majesty's troops in the process. They subjected other posts, including Detroit and Fort Pitt, the later site of Pittsburgh, to protracted sieges. The siege of Detroit began on May 9th, after Pontiac and his supporters had tried and failed to seize the post on the 7th. The siege would last for 5 long months, during which the British worried that they might lose Detroit, one of the most important strategic and economic places in the region. By mid-October, however, the coalition had begun to dissolve, and Pontiac agreed to lift the siege and retreat to the Maumee River for the winter. During the following years, the British scrambled to put back the pieces of the Trans-Appalachian Empire. Correspondence among the British officers during these months demonstrate the real alarm as the British feared they might lose the region altogether. Although it ultimately failed to remove the British from the region, Pontiac's war had nonetheless been a success of sorts, as Gregory Dowd and others have pointed out. And the humbled British now realized that they must accommodate rather than dictate to their native allies. And the Crown recalled Geoffrey Amherst, the arrogant commander of British forces in North America, in favor of Thomas Gates, who was a little bit more conciliatory toward native people. And the king also issued the Proclamation of 1763, which technically prohibited British colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains and did prohibit any British subjects from buying land from natives in that area. And this embargo on native-held lands in the Ohio Valley in turn would push Virginians, like a young man named George Washington, to turn against the British and seek independence in 1776. Pontiac's war carries tremendous symbolic importance to American history. It is a paradigmatic example of the struggle between would-be colonizers and native peoples. Angered at the steady invasion of indigenous territory and the appropriation of indigenous land, native peoples banded together for the mutual benefit and succeeded, at least temporarily, in halting the invasion of Europeans. And in that way, Pontiac is seen as a predecessor for later pan-indigenous leaders, such as Tecumseh, such as the Lakota man Sitting Bull, such as the Chiricahua Apache man Geronimo, all of whom are going to use this pan-indigenous appeal to create resistance to first the British and then the United States. Right, so that's the more familiar part of the struggle, the Pontiac's war against the British. But as I said earlier, I want to kind of complicate this and suggest that we also have to understand what's happening locally and between Indigenous groups to really understand what's happening. So I'm going to talk in the next few minutes about Pontiac's other war. And in this other war, Pontiac is going to reject the prominence that the Wyandots in particular gain after the fall of New France and after the arrival of the British in this region. And that these two conflicts are going to overlap and intertwine during these years. While the traditional account, the account that focuses on Pontiac's war, is not wrong per se, it fails to situate Pontiac's war in its most immediate context, a set of relationships among Indigenous people settled at Detroit. In doing so, it centers the British and their actions and neglects the complicated calculations that Indigenous people like Pontiac and his Wyandot rivals faced. As the opening vignette demonstrates, Pontiac's struggle was not simply with the British. His anti-British campaign merged and overlapped with a much older one with his near neighbors, the Wyandots, with whom the Odawaag had been allied for more than a century and sources indicate for much longer than a century. In many ways, Pontiac's other war that waged against the Wyandots was merely the latest chapter in a long-running rivalry between the two peoples. At the heart of that rival was an unequal power dynamic. With a large population, strong connections to other Algonquin-speaking peoples in the region, especially those who identified as Anishinaabe, people who are descended from an ancestral group, the Anishinaabe, also referred to as the real people. This included the Odawas, but also the Ojibwa and the Odawa or Potawatomis as well. Right. As a result of this, the Odawa had emerged as the most powerful people in the region, the quote, eldest brother of France's victive family by the end of the 17th century. Tied by kinship to the culturally and linguistically similar Ojibwa and Odawa, the Odawa can position themselves as key players in the region. In fact, a recent monograph refers to the Odawa as the masters of empire who are successful at basically manipulating the British into doing what they want them to do. In contrast to the Odawaag, the Wyandots were a small and diplomatically isolated people. Once a large and influential force within the alliance living east of Lake Huron, the Wyandots had suffered unrelenting attacks from their Haudenosaunee or Iroquois enemies in the 1640s and had fled, humiliated, and decimated from their homeland to take refuge among their Odawa neighbors. As the French commander of Detroit had noted, the Wyandots' sword had been cut forth. Weak and vulnerable, the Wyandots had to accept an embarrassing dependence upon the Odawa for protection, for mediation with sometimes antagonistic Algonquin-speaking people in the region. Resenting this humiliating dependence on their Odawa allies and neighbors, the Wyandots tirelessly sought to assert their independence and autonomy, to create alternative alliances and rival diplomatic networks, and to undermine Odawa power. The Odawa reacted to these challenges with intimidation and occasionally force, sparking violence at least twice in 1706 and 1738. This pattern of alliance, cooperation, dependence, resentment, and conflict defined Odawa-Wyandot relations, and it was itself entwined with other relationships, particularly the Odawa's relationship with the Odawa and Ojibwa, and the Wyandots' continuing relationship with the Haudenosaunee, particularly the Senecas, but later the Mohawks and others. Together, these intertwined relationships constituted an indigenous political system in the Great Lakes region, a dense lattice of fictive kinship, rivalry, and alliance. Pontiac, the Odawa, and the Wyandot leaders Teata and Otikuraron therefore performed roles defined for them by their ancestors long before 1763. While the Wyandotte leaders objected to British trade and imperial policy just as adamantly as Pontiac, and in fact, some Wyandots eagerly joined the anti-British movement, Tiata and Otecuronon hope to resolve these differences through diplomatic pressure rather than violent removal of the British from the region. After initially refusing to participate in the conflict, the Wyandots grudgingly participated when they were compelled to do so, but quickly abandoned the siege and actively undermined Pontiac and his allies for the rest of the summer and for years after. Right? In doing so, they once again sought to assert their autonomy against a more powerful ally. For Pontiac, Wyandotte opposition to his plan and active collaboration with the British threatened to undermine his diverse and fractious coalition. The Odawa frequently demanded that the Wyandots join the struggle against the British, especially in those moments in which his support and prospects seemed to wane. This other drama, the indigenous political dynamic, unfolded in tandem and in conversation with Pontiac's anti-British campaign between 1762 and 1764. When we map this other conflict onto the anti-British campaign, we see that the two were intricately connected and inseparable, that indigenous and imperial politics, though distinct, nevertheless shaped and blended into one another. This rivalry, Pontiac's other war, entwined with the imperial campaign from the outset and may have even pushed Pontiac to reject British rule and to organize his anti-British campaign. Since at least the 1660s, the Odawa had been France's most important ally in the Great Lakes. Well connected and respected by the peoples of the region, the Odawaag had grown accustomed to this privileged position and expected the respect and deference due them. The French and Odawa dramatized this relationship in a conference held in 1744. In that year, the French commandant of Detroit held a council with the peoples there to announce that the French had once again resumed war with Great Britain. And the commandant explicitly testified to Odawa's seniority at Detroit, saying, "My eldest son, the Odawas, it is to you that I address myself first." Speaking in the metaphorical language of Algonquian diplomacy and the discourse of alliance politics, the French officer testified, as had his predecessors, to the Odawa's seniority at Detroit. The British officials, however, had contravened the status quo by promoting the Wyandots, not the Odawa, as their senior partners at Detroit. During the last phases of the imperial rivalry in the 1740s and 1750s, the Wyandots had begun developing ties to British fur traders in the Ohio Valley. And in fact, many had moved into the Ohio Valley to more easily deal with the British, both economically by trading and politically as well. In 1755, at the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, Wyandotte representatives had even ventured as far as Philadelphia, at the heart, many would argue, of the British North American Empire, to reaffirm their friendship with the British and offer an outright alliance should the British defeat the French and, quote, come into our country. When the British did, in fact, defeat the French in 1760 and came into the Wyandots' country, they quite understandably preferred to deal with the Wyandots rather than the Odawa, who they had consistently been at odds with and who often appeared as their most inveterate enemies. When Sir William Johnson, the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs in the North, visited Detroit in 1761, he showed a clear preference for the Wyandots over the Odawa, addressing them first in a council with all the nations of Detroit, and then crossing the river to meet with them personally and privately in their village. He declared that the Wyandots, not the Odawa, had to be the head of the Ottawa Confederacy, not appreciating the irony that the Wyandots were the head of the Ottawa Confederacy, and charged them, not the Odawa, to maintain the council fire that he had just symbolically lit. He simultaneously disregarded the Odawa as mere et ceteras or afterthoughts to British imperial ambitions. For Pontiac, who likely attended the 1744 council as a junior chief and the 1761 meeting as a senior Ogaima or headman, the decline of Odawa fortunes must have been insufferable. The British had already signaled their intent to contravene the status quo as it long existed by reducing or discontinuing the yearly outlays of gifts, by outlawing the alcohol trade, and by neglecting diplomatic protocol. Now they contravene yet another feature of that status quo, the Odawa's position at the heart of the alliance in favor of their Wyandotte rivals. Pontiac certainly might have found enough to object to in the new British alliance, even if they had not preferred the Wyandots over the Odawa. But given the long history of rivalry between the two peoples, given the long heritage of Odawa dominance in the region, and given the dynamic shift in the status, the British promotion of the Wyandots at the expense of the Odawa certainly contributed to his resentment against the British and the Wyandots. Pontiac therefore resolved to wage a double war, one to oust the British and return the French to the Great Lakes, and the other to demonstrate Odawa seniority and power over the Wyandots. And so Pontiac is going to do this in a number of ways, particularly by encouraging or asking the Wyandots to participate in the siege, and after the Wyandots decline on several occasions. So by at least early spring, Pontiac had invited the Wyandots to join his campaign. In early May, he does so again. Again, they decline and say they don't want any part of it. This leads into May 10th, the day after the first shots are fired in the conflict. On that morning, the Odawa go to Detroit and start firing early in the morning. Eventually, they leave, and the Wyandots show up and hold a council with Henry Gladwin, the commandant there, and over a glass of rum from his private stash, no less. They declare that they're going to stay neutral, and they're also going to try to diplomatically resolve this conflict and force the British to make peace with them. Ultimately, however, as we talked about at the beginning, Pontiac comes to the Odawa village on the 11th and insists that the Wyandots join him. They still resist that, but ultimately they are forced to join the campaign on the 12th. And then about 4 days later, they leave it altogether. Right? In the following weeks and months, the Wyandots moved from neutrality to often meeting with Gladwin, first through their interpreter and later in person, at which they insist that they are innocent, that they were forced into this conflict, and seek to work with Pontiac's other allies to make a peaceful resolution here. Right? So you can see they meet on the 22nd, 27th of May, again on June 16th, on July 7th, 8th, 9th, and 11th. Also that the Odawaag follows suit. In response to all of this, Pontiac comes back to the Wyandots on July 10th, threatens them again, but this has little effect on the Wyandots. Ultimately, this lasts even longer than the siege of Detroit. So after the siege lifts, the Pontiac is still insistent that the Wyandots not make peace with the British, and in fact, later on in 1763 and in 1764 as well, threatens to destroy the Wyandots for their cooperation with the British. Okay, so in conclusion, these two distinct conflicts, one, an anti-British campaign waged by a pan-Indigenous confederation, and the other fight for status between two old rivals, coincided at Detroit in 1763. Fought for different reasons, these two conflicts nonetheless unfolded simultaneously and occasionally overlapped and entwined with one another. In fact, the British preference for the Wyandots probably contributed to Pontiac's animosity in the first place. The Wyandots encouraged the Odawaag, some of Pontiac's most important allies in the campaign, to make peace with Britain in July, significantly undermining the anti-British campaign. Like a double helix, these two stories paralleled and mutually shaped one another, while each strand in turn articulated with the other relationships. And that a conflict between the Odawa and Wyandots shaped the struggle between the British and Pontiac tells us much about early America and the history of colonialism. Familiar narratives had long told us that colonial relationships were primarily two-sided. Whether they fought against, compromised with, or subjugated Native peoples, European newcomers always interacted with Native people. This story places European-Native relations squarely at the center of the story, leaving Native peoples to respond or resist European power. Yet if Pontiac's war, a paradigmatic example of imperial politics in colonial America, was itself enmeshed in and inextricable from a conflict among Native peoples, we must recognize that colonial relationships were themselves shaped and blunted by the web of indigenous relationships in which they were hopelessly entangled. In fact, the European colonial ambitions and relations were woven into and partially constituted by this larger set of relationships. Thank you so much for your attention and for being here today. It did go over by a little bit, but we still have some time for questions, either from folks in the room, or I don't know how to handle online questions that folks might have.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on it. If we get any, I'll make sure I relay it.
Okay, thank you.
Where did the Odawa meet or other allies of the Federation fall in the conflict in like
So that's a great question. And that's what I'm working on right now, actually. So it turns out that the Odawaag were actually kind of divided themselves. So there's a group who joined Pontiac really early on and are kind of gung-ho about it. But there are other Odawaag who are like the Wyandots who want to stay neutral, who don't want to get on board with this. And what I'm kind of teasing out now is it seems that Pontiac gets especially upset about the Wyandots neutrality because it looks like the Odawaag are going to follow them in that neutrality. So he's most upset about the fact that the Wyandots are undermining his coalition. Really interesting question. Yeah, John.
To the question of methodology and ethnohistory, in what ways did using ethnohistory lead you to other sources to write this story? Or is it simply reading the same sources from, coming from a different perspective? And if the latter, describe that process a little bit.
Yeah, so both. One thing that I've done is look carefully at later records of indigenous oral traditions. So there are the generation of indigenous people who are literate in English in the 19th century who start to write these down. So I've looked really extensively at those. I've also looked at things like linguistics. There are hints at. So certainly there are other sources that I've used there, but it also has been kind of this approach of reevaluating these European documents in ways that try to triangulate at least what indigenous people are thinking and trying to do, right? So one of the ways you can do that is, so these documents are they're obviously ethnocentric, they're obviously racist, but they do, I would argue, fairly accurately describe what's actually happening, right? So they describe what Native people are doing. They're just describing the wrong reasons to it. So what ethnohistory allows you to do is to say, okay, we know at least this much about indigenous culture, so we can kind of reinterpret what those actions are about and give it a story that doesn't privilege that European perspective. But obviously it's a partial look and methodologically really difficult to say for sure.
We've got one question from Zoom audience. So they're interested in your perspectives and arguments. If your perspectives and arguments are part of a larger historiography on indigenous history, and whether others do or could use this model for different contexts, like Spanish territories in the Southwest.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, so this is curious what my colleague who also does indigenous history thinks about this, but it seems like this is a direction that the field of ethnohistory and indigenous history is moving in, is acknowledging the complexity of indigenous relationships. So in terms of the American Southwest, Juliana Barr writes about the really complicated situation of what's going on in colonial Texas, and really situates the Spanish as kind of this marginal group who are barely surviving, and only do so because indigenous people decide that they don't want to wipe them out. So there certainly are voices that are trying to understand what these complicated indigenous relationships are doing. And I think that that is a direction the field is going in. And certainly my own thinking has been shaped by particularly the Spanish example in Mesoamerica, and thinking about, for example, the conquest of Mexico, which was seen as, for so long, as kind of this European conquest victory over indigenous people. But as scholars have recognized for a generation at least, this was only possible because other indigenous people and allies banded with the Spanish against the Aztecs to take them down. So I think when you start looking at a lot of these colonial imperial situations, it becomes immediately much less clear that it's about the imperializers and the native people, and a lot more complicated than that. I don't know about the African example all that well, but I'm going to guess there's similarities there too. Right. Well, again, thank you for braving the Snowmageddon, for coming here. And everybody stay warm and safe as you try to get home and survive the next couple of days. Thanks again for coming.